JavaScript is basically our next tier of functionality that we're going to add on top of HTML and CSS, which we already hopefully know reasonably well now. And JavaScript, as I say here, is a client-side scripting language. So I say that to differentiate it from a server-side scripting language like PHP, which is executed on the actual web server itself, and then basically just the content, the output of that script is returned and then rendered by the browser. Now JavaScript, being a client-side scripting language, is actually delivered to the browser. The code itself is delivered to the browser, and then it's actually interpreted and executed by the browser itself. So before the code actually runs, it will be the JavaScript file or code will be downloaded to the browser and then run by the browser. So it's important, and it can become important later on to understand those differences. But for our purposes, that's all we really need to know now, is that it's executed inside the browser. Now, our advantages for that mean that we don't have to have a fancy PHP server set up to run this. We can run any JavaScript code just directly in the browser itself. So the major things that we use JavaScript for are things that we can't do with just plain HTML and CSS by itself. And namely, the two main categories of things they are is manipulating the web page, so changing the content of the page without having to refresh it, and also responding to interaction, responding to events. So things like mouse clicks and or form submissions, or basically anything. You could respond to a browser window resizing, for example. Okay, but anything involving response to user interaction or data interaction. So if you have any experience with any programming language already, then JavaScript, a lot of the syntax of JavaScript should seem familiar. If you don't have any experience with any scripting or programming languages, then JavaScript's a very good one to start with. The good thing about programming is once you are familiar with one language, the principles are generally very similar across many other languages, and so the only thing that changes a little bit is the syntax. So I think JavaScript is a very good first language to use, and if you only ever learn one language, I think it's a very good one to use because it's probably the most widely implemented programming language in the world, being the language of the web. So definitely a very useful skill to have as a web designer. Even if you never become an expert in it, even just the ability to be able to read JavaScript and understand what it's doing is always going to be a very, very valuable skill to have, particularly down the track when it comes to other work. So we're obviously not going to become experts in JavaScript just in a few weeks of looking at it. So my aim is to give you basically an overview and then maybe some examples, and then it's kind of up to you how much of your time you want to invest in learning more of the details of it. And so, as I said, it's beneficial in general, but also this should give you some of the skills that you need to perhaps implement some sort of functionality in your prototype for assignment 2 as well. And I'm happy in the coming weeks, if there's a particular thing that you want to try and achieve in JavaScript, to help you out with that. But my goal today is basically just to give you an overview and an example of the sort of things that you can do with JavaScript, and then point you in some other directions where you can take it from there. Now, you will notice in my notes for this week, in our notes for this week, that there is information on both JavaScript and jQuery. Decided to actually split this up across a couple of weeks so as not to bombard you with too much information at once. So we will look into jQuery next week, but I won't really mention it so much for this week. I'll just mainly be sticking to the JavaScript. And jQuery is just an extension of JavaScript, so it's logical to look at that after we look at JavaScript. There's some example code here which contains some examples that Cassie did up, which I'm going to go over similar stuff, but I'm not necessarily going to refer to those. But if you want to download those later on and have a look and play around with the code in there, that will be good, probably be useful. And then I've got a section here of more resources, which I'll talk to these a bit more at the end. Okay, but I will cover most of what I'm talking about here in this JavaScript section, and by the end of next week we will have covered kind of everything I've mentioned in here as well. All right, so I'll jump over to an example. So I'm going to create I'm just going to create an empty folder, nothing in it to begin with. Let's call this JavaScript, and I'm going to open this folder up in my editor. Sorry, it disappeared somewhere. Try quit and restart that. Okay, here we go. Alright, so I've got an empty folder here. I'm starting off with absolutely nothing. Now I'm just going to create a new empty HTML document. So I'll just call this JavaScript intro.html. Okay, and I've just got a skeleton layout for a HTML5 document, okay, with no content in it. So I'll just put some content in the body just so that we can see that there's something there. Okay, so I have a heading, and I'll have a paragraph of just some dummy text. Okay, so let me open this in my browser. Okay, so this is what my web page looks like. Now, the only reason I've put that there is so that we've got something to see. So I guess the first thing to know is how do we write our JavaScript? Well, the way that we do that is very similar to the way that we insert other non-HTML text into our HTML document. So you should be familiar with including CSS styles, for example. So the way that we would include an inline or an embedded CSS style in this document would be to use a style tag. Okay, and then we can write some CSS in here. Okay, so we could write a CSS class that sets the text color to be red. Okay, and give that a class name of red. So that there is a bit of CSS code or text embedded inside an HTML document. Okay, and so we use these opening and closing tags to basically tell the browser to interpret what's between there, not as HTML or as plain text, but to interpret that as CSS. So we use the same technique to delineate what should be interpreted as JavaScript. But the tag that we use to do that is the script tag. Okay, which looks like this. So there's an opening script tag and a closing script tag, and we give it this type attribute of text/JavaScript. Okay, and then anything we write in between these opening and closing tags will be interpreted by the browser as JavaScript code. So I can write something in here. So I'll just write a simple statement of JavaScript. Looks like this: alert, hello world. Okay, so that's one line of JavaScript there. Okay, so this alert here is what's called a function. Okay, a function is a bit of predefined code which does something. So alert is a JavaScript function, and when you call it, it pops up an alert dialog on the web browser. And the text that we'll put inside that dialog is whatever you pass it here in what's called this function parameter. Okay, and that's the function parameters are always inside these rounded brackets, and then finally there's a semicolon here at the end. We need the semicolon at the end because if I was to write another line of JavaScript, if I was to write a second alert, okay, if I was to write these, even though I've got them on separate lines, it's not actually putting it on a new line that tells it that it's a new JavaScript statement. Just like I could write all of my CSS on one line or all of my HTML on one line like this, okay, I could also write my JavaScript on one line like this. So it's not the white space that determines where the statement ends, it's the semicolon. So that's why we need to have the semicolon to tell it when the statement is finished. So the reason that we put things on multiple lines is purely because that makes our code more legible. Okay, but it's important that we end every statement of JavaScript with a semicolon. So we should see the result of what this code does. So I'll jump over to my web page again here, and I'll refresh the page. Okay, and there's the alert that pops up there. There's the text, hello world, which is exactly what I put inside of this function parameter here. Okay, and then I can dismiss the alert, and then the page loads. Now, what I want you to notice is that if I refresh this again, notice how the alert dialog comes up before any of the text is rendered. Okay, the page doesn't get rendered until after I've dismissed that alert. Now, this is because where you position your JavaScript in your HTML file actually makes a difference. Okay, so if I take this little script here and I move it down to between the heading 1 and the paragraph, okay, and I go and refresh my page again, okay, you'll notice that is basically performing this exactly where I've put it in the file. So it's going to come down top to bottom, render all this HTML, render that heading 1, then get to my script. So you can see it basically gets everything down to here, and then the script operates, and then it does the rest of it. Okay, so the position of your script in your file actually makes a difference. Now, the reason this can be important is because often your JavaScript file will want to refer to HTML elements in the page. And if I've got a script up here which is trying to refer to my heading 1 before it's actually rendered on the page, then it won't know what I'm talking about. Okay, so that's just something you need to kind of be aware of. Also, if you have scripts that depend on other scripts, those other scripts that they depend on need to be put first. So a best practice way of kind of generally dealing with this issue is to put your JavaScripts as pretty much the last thing on your page after all of the other HTML content is rendered. So best practice generally considered that you put your scripts just before the closing body tag, unless there's a reason that for some reason it needs to be loaded before the HTML. Okay. Okay, so I might show you a couple more ways of outputting information from JavaScript. So the alert, as we saw, does this. Okay, puts up an alert window. Another very useful way of outputting information is to use what's called the JavaScript console. And this is generally useful for outputting information sort of silently or unobtrusively for debugging, which is something that you'll see me do quite a lot. So I'll just show you the difference. If I change this alert to a function called console.log, Okay, and then I refresh the page. Okay, the alert no longer shows up, but where is it output? Well, where it has output is actually in the JavaScript console. Now, to find that you have to find where that is in the web browser that you're using. It will generally be in something called developer tools or something similar to that. So in Chrome I can find it under view and then developer and then developer tools like this. I usually shortcut get to it just by doing a right click and an inspect element. So I think I've shown you this interface before, where that's really useful again for debugging, where you can inspect the HTML code. So there's another section of this. Drag this over up here called the console. Okay, and if I click on that, okay, then I can see that's where the hello world is being output from that console.log statement. So you'll have this in any modern browser. Firebug has it. Firefox's own included code inspection tools has it. Safari will have a very similar looking one to this one on Chrome, and new versions of Internet Explorer should have it as well. So this is just very useful for sort of outputting stuff for testing that that doesn't have to hold up the execution of the script if we would just output an alert every time we wanted to show something. So that's console.log. Okay. Another way of outputting then is actually outputting to the page itself. Okay, so there's the way that we can do that is there's a few ways we can do that. One way of doing it is to use a function called document.write. Okay. Okay, so we write something like that, and that will actually output that information to the page. Okay, and again, the position of this matters. So if I put that between the heading 1 and the paragraph, okay, that's where it's going to output using document.write. Okay, and then I'll explain some other ways of manipulating the page content later on as well. Okay, I'll get rid of that. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is internal versus external JavaScript. Okay, so again, I'm going to make an analogy to CSS, which we're already familiar with. This is one way of writing our CSS, but we also know that you can embed an external style sheet, okay, using something like this. Okay, using a link tag with rel style sheet, type text CSS, and then an href which points to an external style sheet. Okay, so if I have a style sheet here, okay, and I can point to style.css like that. Okay, and that basically imports any styles that I might write inside this external style sheet. Now, in the same way, we can write our JavaScript in external files and import them like that as well. Okay, so so what I might do is create an external JavaScript file. I like to keep my JavaScript files sort of arranged in their own folder. So I'm just going to create a folder here called JS, and then inside of that I'm going to create a new file. Okay, and again, you can call your files whatever you want, but a JavaScript file, the file extension just has to end in .js. Okay, so I'll call this myscript.js. Okay, all right, and there it is there. Okay, it's completely empty, but I can write something in here. I can do a console.log hello from an external script. Okay, and in order to basically import this script, okay, basically I do a very similar thing to this script tag here, except it looks like this. Oops. Okay, so it's the same script tag, except we put nothing. We put nothing inside it itself. Instead, we add this attribute src, the same as the source attribute if we were referring to an image, for example. Okay, and then put the path to our JavaScript file in there. So for me, it's in a folder called JS, and then the file's called myscript.js. Okay, so what that will do is it will go and look for that file, and then basically, effectively, it's exactly the same as grabbing all of the JavaScript code out of here and then chucking it inside of this script tag. Okay, so that's how we refer to an external JavaScript. And the reason that we use an would use an external JavaScript file is for all the same advantages that using an external CSS file gives us. Okay, so one, it keeps our code all together, so it's easy to keep organized and be readable and so forth. And the other reason is, as you know, if I was to have another HTML file which I wanted to reference this red style, and I had done all of my styles like this, okay, I'd have to duplicate that style across all of my HTML files. Whereas if I had put it in my external style sheet, like this, okay, then all I have to do is import that style sheet into any HTML file that I want to reference that style sheet. Okay, so that's the same benefits with JavaScript. If you likely write JavaScript code that is going to be usable by multiple different HTML files, so rather than duplicating that code and having to maintain that code in multiple versions of itself, we put it in an external file and then we just link each of the HTML files that use it to that same JavaScript file. So for the rest of my examples, I'm going to put all of my code in the external JavaScript file, but I do just want to reiterate once more that the order of these script statements again is going to matter. Okay, so if I refresh the page here, I get my hello world and then hello from an external script. Okay, if I reverse the order of these scripts, then their execution order is going to reverse. Okay, so it does the external script first and then the internal script. Okay, so if one of these relies on the other, then I need to make sure I include the script that's being relied upon first, and that will come to the fore more next week when we start using external JavaScript libraries like jQuery. Okay, but for now, I'm just going to keep my JavaScript code in this external script file. Okay, there we go. So let's talk about some of the syntax of the JavaScript programming language. The first thing I want to show you is how to write comments in your JavaScript code. Now, comments you may be familiar with already, maybe HTML comments. So an HTML comment looks like this. Okay, and basically the idea of a comment in any programming language is that it's not a functional line of code. Okay, if I load this in the HTML, okay, this paragraph actually tells the browser to render something, okay, as does this script, okay, but this here does nothing. It's just a comment designed for just that commenting your code. So it's designed for you to be able to write places throughout the code to remind yourself of what maybe what the following section of code does, and also if you were to give your code to someone else, make it a bit easier to read for them. Okay, so that's an HTML comment. This is actually a reasonably unusual syntax when it comes to programming languages for commenting. CSS also has comments. Okay, so a CSS comment, the syntax looks like this. So I might say, for example, sets the font color to red. Okay, so maybe I need to remind myself what exactly this does. Okay, in CSS, the syntax for a comment looks like this. It's basically text surrounded by / star, and then the reverse of that star / at the end. That's how we write a CSS comment. Now, in JavaScript, we actually have two different ways of writing comments. We have what's called a single line comment and a multi-line comment. A single line comment looks like this. It's just 2 / and then whatever comes after that up to the end of a line is interpreted as a comment. Okay, so I can put that on its own line, or I can put it at the end of a statement. Okay. So maybe I need to remind myself that this outputs to the console. Alright, and then the second type of comment I have is a multi-line comment, okay, which looks exactly the same as the CSS comment. Okay, it's just anything surrounded by at the beginning / star, and then at the end the reverse that / So this is a multi-line comment. Okay, and they're the two methods of commenting. So you can use / for a single line comment, or this syntax for a comment that goes over multiple lines. Okay, so you'll notice if I keep writing on this next comment, okay, that's going to be interpreted as JavaScript statements again. So there are two methods of commenting. Now, there is another reason that we use comments, and that is to do something which you'll hear me refer to as commenting out a line of code. So let's just say, for example, I want to see what the program looks like. Let's say I've got this alert here. Okay, I've got an alert here, and I refresh my page, and every time I refresh my page, I have to dismiss that alert. Okay, so maybe I want to see what the page looks like without that, but there's a chance I will want to put it back in, so I don't want to just delete it and have to retype it. So the easiest way to temporarily disable that is just to turn it into a comment, okay, by either making it a single or a multi-line comment. Okay, maybe I have multiple statements that I want to disable. Okay, and so I could put a multi-line comment around it. Okay, so that basically just turns it into a non-functional statement. The browser will interpret that as just a comment and won't bother trying to execute any of that script. Okay, so I can go in and refresh that. Okay, and those alerts clearly aren't happening. Okay, but if I want to get them back, I don't have to go and type out those lines of code again. I just uncomment that area, okay, and then those 3 alerts happen again. So that's what you'll see me using comments for as well. Okay, and so I'm going to comment out that line. So let's see what next. Okay, so now let's look at some more of the features of the JavaScript programming language. So pretty much any programming language is going to introduce the concept of variables, and variables are just a way of storing bits of information temporarily. Okay, so let's say, for example, I want to describe a person, and I want to store some bits of information about them. Then I can create a variable, for example, to store my name. Let's say I want to create a variable to store my first name. Then the way I create a variable is the first time I define it, I have to define this with this keyword here, var, short for variable, and then I give my variable a name. Okay, so say first name equals, and then give it a value. Okay, so the equal sign assigns a value to the variable, and then I've got the value here, and then the semicolon to end my statement. Okay, so that's how we define a variable, and then I can use that variable later on for whatever purposes I want. Okay, so I could say console.log first name. Alright, and now my console should output, there we go, whatever the value of first name is. Okay, if I change that name, say I change my name to Dexter, okay, then that variable will change to reflect that. Okay, so now there are some rules when it comes to naming variables. The first one is it has to be one whole word. There can't be any spaces in it. If you put a space in between them, it's not going to know what you're talking about. So the thing to understand about any programming language is it's not particularly smart. It can't interpret things that are slightly different. I mean, if you look at that, you can probably figure out what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to create a variable called first name, but you have to tell it exactly what to do in exactly the way that it expects. So the first rule is it can't have any space. It's got to be one full word. Now, this means that it can be a little bit hard to read. Okay, so especially if you've got multiple words that you condense down to one word. So there's usually two ways that we can improve the readability of this. First one is, rather than putting a space in, anywhere there would be a space, we put an underscore, so you'll see that done a lot. And then the second is to do what's called camel casing, which is you start off the variable name with a lowercase, you start off the first word, the variable name with a lowercase letter, and then each subsequent word you change to an uppercase letter. So you'll often see things written like that, and you'll see this done. For example, if I call a JavaScript function like document dot get element by class name, for example. Okay, you can see that's what they've done here. So this is called camel casing. First word of that particular variable name or function name is lowercase, and then each subsequent word starts with uppercase. It's just a bit easier to read. Okay, it's not a functional requirement, but it's a convention that makes it easier to read. So they're the two ways you generally see that done. Other rules is you can only use letters and numbers and underscores. Okay, no other weird characters. So kind of like the same characters that you're only allowed to use in email. I guess that's not actually a very good example. But the variable name can only be made up of letters, numbers, and underscores. Okay, so something like that is a valid variable name. And then the final rule is that while it can have numbers, okay, it can't start with a number. So while first name 1 is a valid variable name, 1 or 1st first name is not. Okay, so it can't start with a number. Okay, other than that, you can name it pretty much whatever you want. Okay, so there's my first name. So I can create another variable, call it last name. Put my last name in there. Okay, and so we can do things like, we'll do a console.log. So these variables that I've typed here are what we call string variables. So variables can have different data types, and these ones are string, and string is just programming speak for text. I don't know why they call it string, they just do. So anyway you see string, just read that as text. So this is opposed to, let's say if I created a variable for my height. Okay, so my height in meters 1.85. Okay, let's write a little comment there to say meters. Or my weight 80. That's kgs. Okay, so these variables are both of type number. Okay, so there is actually a difference between writing that and writing this. Okay, this is a string which happens to contain the characters 8 and 0. Okay, whereas without the inverted commas, this is a number with which you can perform mathematical operations. Okay, so we can do things like, now with strings. Okay, with strings. No, actually, I'll go with numbers first. So let's just say, all right, let's back up a little. Let's just say I create a variable, random variable x, 10, variable y equals 1.5. So you'll often see, especially number variables, just written as abstract characters like x or y, just like you would in algebra. Okay, so you can do that too. It is obviously useful if your data actually has some sort of meaning, to give it some semantically meaningful name. Okay, but you can just there's nothing invalid about writing your variables as just single letters like this. Okay, but that's sort of beside the point. So I've got these two number variables x and y here. Now with number variables I can do mathematical operations. Okay, so I can output, for example, the sum of x plus y. Okay, I can also do the subtraction, multiplication, division, and actually a fifth one called the modulus operator. And what this does is it does the division, but gives you the remainder of the division rather than the actual number itself. Probably not one that you use that often, but it's there. So we can see what this looks like. Okay, so there's the result. Okay, of those numerical operations. Now, if I have, so let's get rid of that. Let's just look at this example of x plus y. Or let's do x. Yeah, okay, let's do x plus y. Now let's say I have one of these is actually a string. I'm actually not 100% sure what's going to happen here, so I might just check. Yeah, okay, so if I change one of these to a string with the characters 1 and 0 in it, and I try and perform this operation, what you'll see is it won't output 11.5. What it's actually output is 101.5. And the reason it's done that is because you can actually use this plus operator on strings. I can, for example, do console.log first name plus a space plus my last name. Okay, and then that will output my first name variable and then a space and then my last name. So that's actually the plus operator, when performed on strings, actually joins them together. It's called string concatenation. But if you mix your variables now, so let's say I try and do my first name plus the number variable y, okay, then we'll see what happens. Okay, it says Dave and then 1.5. So the reason it's chosen to concatenate rather than try and do a mathematical operation is because, well, really that's the only valid way it can do it. It can't take these characters and attempt to do some sort of mathematical addition with a number. So what it does is it interprets that number as a string and then concatenates those two strings. Okay, but in the same way, if we do x plus y, okay, because x is defined as a string and it doesn't know, again, it's not intelligent to know that that's the only thing it's going to be. It could be 10 ABC, ASDF. Okay, so it's going to then interpret that as a string and then basically have to convert this to a string. So that's why we get basically 10 and then joined onto the end of that 1.5, and then it looks like this. Okay, so that's sort of the important thing to know about mixing variables. Okay, but to simplify that, basically, if you've got number data types, you can perform mathematical operations on them. If you've got strings, really the only thing you can do is join them together, okay, using the plus symbol. Okay, now there's a third data type called a Boolean. So I'll create one here. I'll call this is male. Okay, so a Boolean data type basically can only contain one of two values. It's either true or it's false. So you use this to test conditions. So I could, for example, have a line of code like this, console.log, and I can say first name plus space plus last name plus is male or is female. Okay, so basically, let's say I only want one of these lines of code to operate based on whether or not the variable is male is true or false. Okay, so if Ismail is true, then I want it to output this one which says Dave Wallace is male. Okay, if it's not, then I want it to output Dave Wallace is female. So the way that I can do that is by using what's called a conditional statement. So far everything we've written, every line of code has been executed, but you can write constructs so that it will only execute certain bits of code depending on a condition. And the way that we do this is by using something called an if statement. And an if statement looks like this. Okay, it's the keyword if, and then you've got your rounded parentheses, and then you've got some curly braces. And so basically what happens is we put some sort of condition in here. Okay, so that condition might be, well, if a value called x is less than 100, then do something. Okay, or in this case, I'm going to say if isMale is equal to true, then do this particular console.log. Okay, and then I can extend this by saying either else if, and then having another condition, and then having more and more conditions. Okay, or I can just say else, so otherwise. I know there's only two conditions here. Ismail's either going to be true or it isn't, so I only really need two conditions. So I can say otherwise do this console.log. Okay, so let's do a test here. So I'll go console.log is male. Okay, so what this is going to do is come down here and basically look up is male, and if it's equal to true, then it's going to do this. Otherwise, it's going to do this. Okay, but it's only going to do one or the other. Now, I should just mention here that I very deliberately used a double equal sign here. Okay, so the reason I've used double equal sign here to test for equality is because the single equal sign we already used to assign a value. Okay, so this is a very common syntax error that people will type, is people will forget to type the 2 and that will assign a value, and that statement there actually always returns true, because what this will do is assign that value to this and then return true, basically saying I assigned a value. Okay, so the important thing to remember there is single equal sign for assigning a value to a variable, double equal sign for testing for equality. Okay, so let's see what this does. Okay, I'll refresh that. So you can see my first console.log. I should just actually mention something that I forgot to when I was talking about the console originally. A couple of other useful things that we'll do is anywhere it's output here, it will actually show you the file and the line number that's come from. Okay, so you can go back and cross-reference that. You might have a whole bunch of output and you'll forget which one's actually outputting what. The other reason this is useful is because it will detect errors. So let's say, for example, I forget to close the rounded brackets on that statement. Okay, if I refresh this, okay, the console, so without the console, there's no indication here on the page that there's actually anything wrong with my code. Okay, so the console will indicate to me where there's an error. So JavaScript is what we call a forgiving language. In a lot of languages, if you have an error, nothing will happen. In JavaScript, if you have an error, your HTML will at least still show up. So there's no direct indication that something's gone wrong unless you look at the console here. Okay, but the reason this is good is it highlights this as an error, and it also tells me exactly where in my code to look for the error. And it tells me these messages can often be cryptic when you don't exactly know what they mean. But at least it tells me to look in myscript.js line 18 for an error, and I can at least come here to line 18 and go, okay, I've failed to close that rounded bracket there. And the other thing about the console too is you can actually use it to type and test JavaScript live. Okay, so I could put an alert in here like this. I could type that line of JavaScript, okay, and as soon as I hit return, it will actually perform that line. So I've just put an alert in there. So you can use that to interact with the page in a live fashion as well for testing things. Okay, but let's go back to where I was. So how is this working again? Okay, I've set my variable isMail to be true. Okay, I console.log the value of that just to test. There it is, true. All right, and then it's coming down to this conditional statement. It's saying if isMail is equal to true, then do this first one. Okay, and that's exactly what it does. It outputs my first name, my last name, and then isMail. Okay, but it doesn't perform the second one. All right, if I now go and change the value of this to false, okay, then we should see this change. Okay, so I'll refresh. Okay, the value is false, and now outputs Dave Wallace is female. All right, so let's change that back. Okay, so that's a conditional statement. Okay, so let's see Okay, let's get rid of that now. Okay, I'll show you one more variable type. Okay, and so far, okay, we've looked at strings, numbers, and Boolean values. So far, each of these variables only holds one bit of information. Okay, one piece of information. But let's say for this person, okay, maybe I want to store a list of interests. Okay, so maybe one way of doing it would be to say, create a variable called interests1 equals tennis, and then have a variable interest2, music, okay, and so on and so forth. But a better way of doing this, if you want to store a list of items, is to use a data type called an array. An array is essentially exactly that. It's a list. So what I would do instead is I just create a variable called interests. Okay, but I can assign this variable a list of values by creating an array, and I can do that one of two ways. I can say new array, and then put a bunch of comma separated values in here. Okay, okay, so there we go. I've got an array, a list of 4 items there. The other way of defining this is to do the same thing, but instead of using new array, you just put the comma separated values inside of square brackets. Okay, so that does exactly the same thing. But this way we can assign a bunch of values, and it can be of indeterminate length. We can add things to this list and remove things from this list. Okay, but we can assign multiple values to one variable name. Now the way that we access those values, so if we just want to pull one out of these, well, I mean, let's look at the whole thing first. We do a console.log of interests, okay, and there it outputs, okay, that whole array there. But let's say I just want to refer to one of these. Well, the way that we refer to an individual item inside this is by doing the variable name, and then using the square bracket notation like this, and then we put a number in here which refers to the position in the list that we want to point to. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 items in the list. So if we want to look at this first one, then you might very well assume that we do something like interests 1. Okay, and I'll put that in the console.log so it outputs. Okay, so you might very well expect that this should output tennis, but let's have a look at what it does. And it outputs music. Okay, the reason for that is that the indexing of an array actually starts at 0, not 1. So the first item in an array is at index 0, and then the second item is at index 1. So it's always offset by 1. Okay, so interest 0 would be how we access tennis. And then interest 1 is music, interest 2 is films, interest 3 is travel. Okay, so this becomes important too when in this next thing. So what I want to show you now is, okay, let's just say we want to output these. Okay, if I want to output them all individually one by one, okay, I can do something like this. Okay, and so on and so forth. But again, in programming, we're always trying to write as least code as possible to get the work done. Okay, now this list could be hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of items long. So I'm not going to write a million lines of code just to output everything. So we can use another programming construct called a loop construct to do exactly that with much fewer lines of code. So a loop construct is similar to the conditional construct, so the if statement, but it looks like this. So actually there's a couple of ways that we can write it. Probably the simplest one to understand first off is a while loop. Okay, and it looks like this. While some condition is true, do what's in between the curly braces, and keep doing it while this condition remains true. Okay, so let's just say I want to loop through this list and output one by one the individual items. So what I want to do is basically do a console.log of interests at a particular index. Okay, so what I can do is create a variable called index and set it equal to 0. Okay, and then I can say while index is less than the highest amount. Okay, so I could say now this is where you have to be careful, because I want to say while index is, basically I want this to stop when index is equal to 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so I can say while index is less than or equal to 3, or I could say while index is less than 4. Okay, so while index is less than 4, console.log interest index. So let's modify this a bit. So I'll output the interest at index plus index plus is okay. Now All right, let's see what happens when I run this. Okay, this isn't completely finished yet, but I want to show you what can happen. Okay, so I'm going to refresh this page now, and I want you to notice what happens. Okay, so it says the interest at index 0 is tennis, and then it keeps doing that same one each time. And what you'll notice is that actually the page has hung. I can't do anything. I can't select text. Okay, it's just constantly loading. What I've done is created what's called an infinite loop. This loop, I never change the value of index. Okay, so this statement here is never going to not be true. Okay, if index is always 0, then it's going to go through once, test the condition again, go through again, test the condition again, keep going through. So what we have to do is make sure that we, after we've done this, okay, for each loop we need to change the value of index. Okay, so we can say index equals index plus 1. Okay, and notice when I'm redefining the value, I don't need to include the var statement. You only need the var the very first time you refer to it. Okay, so we need to add 1 to the value of index. Now we can shorthand this by using an increment operator. So I can do the exact same thing by putting a plus plus there. So plus plus is an increment operator. All it does is adds 1 to the value of whatever this is. Okay, so if it's 0, it'll turn it into 1. If it's 1, it will turn it into 2. Okay, and in the same way, we've got minus minus, the decrement operator, which minuses 1 from the value. Okay, so what this does now is test that condition, outputs it, adds 1 to the value of index, goes through the loop again, retests that condition. Okay, so now this value of index you see each time through the loop will be increasing, and it's going to keep doing it until this condition is false, and this condition will be false as soon as index is equal 4, because 4 is not less than 4. Okay, so I need to kill that. It will let me. Reload again. Okay, there we go. So there we go, the interest at index 0 is tennis, 1, 2, 3, okay? And so there's my 4, okay? And again, remembering index starts at 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, first, second, third, fourth. Now, I'm going to modify this a little bit because let's just say I add another interest here. Or let's say I remove one of the interests. Let's say I had a bad traveling experience and no longer like traveling. Okay, this is clearly now going to be wrong, okay, because it's going to keep going off the edge of the list. So I'll see what happens there. Okay, I see interest at index 3 is undefined. Okay, it doesn't exist. So it's good to avoid what we call hard coding values in here. So what I can do is say, well, rather than saying keep index less than 4, I can say keep index less than the length of that list, or the length of that array. And the way I can do that is any array object will have a property called length. So I can say while index is less than interests dot length. Okay, and now it doesn't matter how I modify this. Okay, at that point where it's testing that condition, it will say, okay, what's the length of this list, and it will test for that. So now it doesn't matter whether I have 3 or 4 or 1,000 in here. Okay, that is going to be replaced with whatever the length happens to be at that given time. Okay, and I don't have to go on and keep changing this value, which is good because you may get a list of values from somewhere, maybe from another website, from an API, where you have no idea how many items are in that list. Okay, so that's generally how we would write it to loop over a list. Now the other way of writing a loop is to, instead of writing a while loop, change this to a for loop. And basically all we do is, this is, I guess, a slightly more difficult to understand concept possibly, but it's a more compact way of writing the loop. And basically what we do is we combine these 3 steps, the declaring the counter variable, the testing condition, and the changing of the counter variable into one line. So what I do is I put this here, and I put this here. Okay, and that will do exactly the same thing. So basically here, and as I said before, it's not white space or new lines that delineate the end of statements, it's semicolons. So here what I'm doing is saying, well, as I said, I mean, declare this counter variable here. At the end of the loop, modify it, in this case, add 1 to it, and then the middle one here is always the conditional statement. Okay, so that's the same way of writing that same thing. And it can be a little confusing, I think, when you're first writing it, but it just sort of, it sinks in after a while. So I refresh that. Okay, you can see it does the same thing. Okay, let's see what next. All right, so I'll keep that there. Okay, now let's say, all right, next thing I want to do is I'm going to create a variable to store this person's BMI, or body mass index. So the body mass index, okay, if you never heard of it, basically it's a simple mathematical equation which, based on someone's height and weight, will give you a number which determines whether they're underweight, overweight, or in a healthy weight range. Okay, and that equation looks something like your weight in kilograms divided by your divided by the square of your height in meters. Okay, so I'll write a comment there just to remind myself of that. So what I can do is create a new variable called BMI here, and I can set that equal to, and I can do an equation here. So I'll do the weight divided by the height times itself. Okay, so all right, now so let's console.log this. Okay, so let's do something like, okay, this is a good example to demonstrate something else. So I'm going to output first name plus okay, now you'll notice. No, sorry, I'll finish this and then I'll say that. First name plus last name. MI is plus MI. Let's just make sure this does what I want it to first. Okay, so there it is, outputting there. Dave Wallace's BMI does the equation, 23 point some long decimal number. Okay, so there's a couple of things I want to talk about here. Now, one thing I didn't mention when talking about text strings up here is you can actually define them by using either double or single quotes. So I could have done this like this. Okay, and the reason for that is, let's say you have a string that contains, an apostrophe, like if I want to say Dave's. Okay, if I define that with single quotes, and you can probably see from the syntax highlighting here that this is going to confuse it. It's going to consider that a string, then this a random character, and then that just a a random apostrophe there. Okay, and that's actually going to cause an error. Okay, so for that reason, to make it a bit easier, you can define your string using double quotes if it contains an apostrophe. Or likewise, let's say maybe I want to have a variable called quote, favorite quote. Right, and maybe the quote, you want to contain the quotation marks within that, so you could do it something like this. Okay, so that's why we have the option of using either double or single quotes. Okay, and you can see that operating, just undo that. You can see that operating down here because I'm trying to include this apostrophe S here as well. Okay, hence why I've used double quotes there. And then just a single apostrophe there. Okay, so that works again. That's fine. Now there's a couple of things I want to do here. You'll notice that I've done this thing a few times, okay, and I'm probably going to do it over and over again. And rather than typing that out every time, again, to make this a bit more efficient, what I'm going to do is create my own function, which basically gives me back a joined string of the first and the last name. So just like there's functions like we've used, like alert is a function. Okay, looks like that. We can actually, so alert is a built-in JavaScript function which we pass some data which then does something. There's something that this does is pop up a dialog window. We can actually define our own functions, so bits of repeatable code which we can call over and over again to do something useful. So I'm going to create a function which essentially joins my first and my last name and gets me my full name with a space in the middle. So I'm going to call my function. So first I declare my function using the keyword function, and then I give it a name. The rules for naming functions are the same as those for naming variables. I'm going to call mine get full name. Okay, and I'm going to need to pass this function my first name and last name. Okay, and then I can create a variable inside this function called full name equals first name plus space plus last name. Okay, and then I can return this value to the code that calls it. So I can say return full name. So now anytime I want to use the full name, rather than having to type this, I can just go get full name, first name, last name. Okay, and this will be replaced with basically the output of this function. Alright, get rid of that alert. Or I might create my own variable, full name here. Get full name, first name, last name. Then I can do alert, and in the alert output the full name. Okay, there we go. So formatted nicely, I don't have to write the exact thing. Now that's a fairly trivial example because, I mean, I haven't saved a huge amount of typing here. It's really only one line of code, but the point is this function could have as many lines of code as I want. Okay, so potentially it could save me a lot of typing. Okay, so I'll leave that function there. Now let's see how much time we got left. Okay, that's right. let's say now that we've got this, basically we've defined the variables for one person. Okay, but let's say we now want to create another person's profile and do similar things. What I'm going to do is, well, okay, again, what I could do is duplicate these variables. Okay, but call them like first name 2, last name 2, height 2, for example, okay, and so on and so forth like that. But what I am going to do instead is I'm going to essentially create an object, so a container to hold all the information about one person. And the way I'm going to do that is, again, declare a variable, but this time I'm going to call this person. And I'm going to set this equal to new object. Okay, and what this means now, rather than declaring just like freestanding variables here, what I can do is say that I'll call this person 1, sorry, person 1, and I can say person1 dot first name and person1 dot last name and height and weight and is male and interest. Okay, so now all of these variables are properties of this person object here. Okay, so if I want to create another person, I don't have to go and modify these name values. I don't have to go on, like call these first name 2, last name 2, for example. So if I want to create a new person, I can simply just create a new person object. Okay, and I'll change all these person 1s to person 2. Okay, and give them some different values. So let's call this person Jane Doe. Okay, and give her some different interests. Okay. Alright, so I'm going to get rid of this. And let's get rid of this. And let's get rid of this. Alright, now let's say I want to output the the information for each of these people. Okay, so again, the crudest way of doing this would be to do a console log of all of the variables in person 1, and then repeat the same code to output all of the variables of person 2. But what I can do is write a function which essentially takes a person object and then looks for all those variables inside that object and outputs those. So to demonstrate this, what I might actually do is I'm going to jump back over to my HTML file for a moment. And what I'm going to do is get rid of that. So I'm going to create some say paragraphs here. Okay, so you'll get the idea of what I'm trying to do. Okay, one for name, one for height, one for weight, one for BMI, and let's have a unordered list where we'll output my interests, or a person's interests. So let's see what this looks like here now. Okay, so basically I've got this template and I want to fill in these areas with the information from one or another of those person objects that we have. So I guess I'll do it with one person, and then I'll modify that into a function to see how we can do it with any number of people without having to duplicate the code. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm actually going to put some empty span tags here. Okay, and I'm going to give them an ID, and I'll tell you why I'm doing this in a second. Okay, so I'll give it an ID. This one can be name. Height, weight, BMI, and this one can be interest. Okay. Alright, so I can see them there. There's my empty span tag. Basically, I'm putting that there so I've got something to inject these bits of information into. And the reason that I'm giving it an ID is because that's the way that JavaScript is going to basically point to that particular HTML element. And I do that using a function called document.getElement by ID. And then I pass it the ID name of the element that I want it to refer to. So if I'm referring to this span here, it's got an ID of name. So I'll put that in there, name. Okay, and that by itself doesn't do anything. It just points to that particular element. If I want to modify the contents of that, I then adjust this, or I assign a value to this property of that element called inner HTML, and I set that to be equal to something. Okay, so just to test that, I can set it equal to just Dave. Okay, and there you can see its output that there. And if I look in the code, all right, there's my span element, okay, which was empty, and after the JavaScript operates, is now got my name in there. Okay, and I can show you that it indeed was empty. I'm just putting an alert there. Okay, that's actually probably doesn't really demonstrate it because it's still got the unloaded page there. But anyway, okay, so that's inserting that bit of content into the HTML element with the ID of name, which is that span tag there. Now what I really want to do is insert my full name here. Okay, so I'm going to insert the full name. So I'm going to call this function get full name and pass it person1 dot first name and person1 dot last name. Okay. Oops, yes, sorry, I didn't finish doing this. My mistake. Okay, let's try that again. There we go. Okay, so what that's doing now is selecting that span element and setting the inner HTML to be the result of this function, which, as we know, takes a first name and a last name and returns the joining of those two values with a space in the middle. Okay, which ultimately results in my full name being output there. Okay, same deal with the other fields, I can get the height span tag and set that equal to person1.height. Same deal with the weight. Okay, and same deal with the BMI. Now, I don't actually have this saved as a variable, so what I'm going to do is create another function here, which I should have done earlier, called calculate BMI, which takes a height and a weight and does that calculation for us and returns the weight divided by height times height. Okay, and now anytime I want to generate a BMI, I don't have to go and put that calculation in. Okay, I can just call that function, calculate BMI, with person1.height as the input height and person1.weight as the input weight. Okay, so all of those values now we can see output there. Okay, and I guess I should modify the output of the height so that it tacks on to the end meters and kilograms on the end of weight. Okay, there we go. Alright, so now before I get to the interests, I can already see that again. Okay, if I want to, let's put an alert in here so we can see the difference. If I want to do this, okay, for person 2, I got to come down here and place person 1 with person 2. Okay, and do that. Okay, now if I do this, well, let's just see what this does. Okay, this should output all of person 1's information, pop up an alert, and then when I dismiss that, output all of person 2's information. Okay, alright, so there's person 1's information, dismiss the alert. Okay, now it's outputting person 2's information. So that didn't take me that long to copy and paste into a find and replace. But again, I could have, if it's Facebook, I've got 1 billion users. I'm not going to type that out 1 billion times. Okay, so what I'm going to do is create a function called output person info, which takes a person object, okay, and then basically does all this stuff using whatever person object I pass to it. Okay, so I'll just change any of these references from person1 to just person. Okay, now without calling this function, okay, it's not going to do anything yet. Let's get rid of that alert. Okay, it's not going to do anything. The code's just there, but I have to call it if it's in a function for it to do anything. But now to output a person's information, all I need to do is make a call to output person info and then pass up one of these person objects. So person1, and I'll put an alert in here again just to pause it so we can see the changeover. And then call it again with the person2 object. Okay, so when I call it the first time, the person1 object, okay, all of these values are going to refer to these ones, and then the second time I call it, all of these values are going to refer to these ones. Okay, so let's have a look at what that looks like. Okay, so it outputs the first person, then I dismiss the alert. Okay, it outputs the second person. So you can see where this becomes more useful, whereby if I have more and more users, so I'll create, a third user here. Okay, and change this to okay, and now to output that third person again, we just simply call that function again and pass it the other person object. Okay, there's 1, there's 2, and there's 3. Okay, so we don't have to write as much code. Okay, now let's see. Okay, we need to deal with these interests here. Okay, this is a little bit more complex because we need to output multiple items. But basically, everything now I'm going to do inside of this function. So let's see. Let's try. First of all, we want to refer to this unordered list here again. So I can do a document.get element by ID of interests. Like that, and then I can set the inner HTML to be equal to, well, here we now have the issue of where we're dealing with multiple items in a list, and also multiple of these lists, depending on which person it is going to have different numbers of items. So this is where we need to bring back in that for loop that we had before. So because I deleted it, I'll just have to type it out again. Sorry, for bar I equals 0, I is less than person dot interest dot length I plus plus. Okay, so this is exactly the same as the loop I wrote before to loop over all the elements in the interests list. Okay, so I'm going to output at each point interests person dot interests I. Okay, I think last time I just called this variable index. Now I'm calling it I. Okay, it's the only difference. Doesn't matter. It still does the same thing. Okay, now I will put in another alert here again. So I'm going to strip this back down just to outputting one person's info for now. I'll put an alert there to pause that in there so we can see it as it operates through each iteration of the loop. Okay, so I'll refresh this. Okay, now we can see, okay, it's output the first one. Okay, it's output the second one, but it's overwritten the first one. Okay, it's just replaced it completely. Alright, so what that's doing is it's setting this inner HTML of that unordered list each time. It's overriding everything. So the easiest way to deal with this is basically assigning a value to saying, basically we can say plus equals here, and basically that says rather than overriding everything that's there, tack this on to the end of what's already there. Okay, so we're appending this to what's already the contents of the inner HTML. So if we change it to that, okay, we should be able to see that it outputs the first one, then the second one, then the third one, and then the fourth one, adding it to the end without overriding it. Okay, now what I actually really want to do is output these as list items so they style as a list. So I'm just going to add a list item to the around the outside of this, like so. Okay, and joining those all together with the plus sign because they're all strings. Okay, and now you can see they're being output and styled as, we might even be able to see them up here, as list items. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. Okay, so I'll get rid of that alert there now, because now that I know that's working, I don't really care to pause that every time. Okay, but we can see that will go through the list and output them. Now, we should see how this deals with multiple people. Okay, so again, we'll do another alert, pause here, and then output the second person's information. Okay, so we'll refresh that. Okay, it's output the first list of interests. When I hit OK, it should output the second person's information. We'll see what that does. Okay, so you'll notice that it's replaced all of this stuff successfully, but it's actually it's actually appended the interest to the existing list that was already there. Okay, now the reason for that is because, well, that's exactly what I've told it to do. I've never told it to overwrite the inner HTML here. I've just said whatever's already there, add these on to the end. So the easiest way to fix that is, well, basically I can't assume that there's not already information in this list, because it might already be. So what I'm going to do is just every time I call this output person info function, before I start outputting the interest list, I'm just going to clear it by assigning it a value of an empty string. Okay, so that's an empty string. So basically put nothing in there. Replace whatever's in there with nothing. And then do the loop where I output the interests. Okay, so now when I do it, okay, it will do that. Okay, output the first person's, and then the next time it goes through, it's going to clear this, or set that to empty, that unordered list, and then start outputting the second person's interests. Okay, and we see that gives us the desired effect there. Okay. Let's see. Now, all right, now I think we've probably got enough time for us to do just a couple more things. So at the moment, I'm kind of fudging this so that we can see the different person's information being output. But if we've got an interface like this, what I really want is some way of interacting with the interface to load different person's data. Okay, so let's say what I really want is something like, let's say 3 buttons, which load the three people's the three people's data when I click on them. Okay, so I'll have let's say a button here with an ID of person 1 underscore button. Let's call it something like that. Okay, button. Yeah, okay, let's do it. So person 1 button, person 2 button, person 3 button. Okay, and there's probably better ways of doing this, but I don't want to overcomplicate this example. So I'll just have 3 buttons sitting there like that. And basically what I want to happen is when I click on them, load the corresponding person data into these fields here for person 1, person 2, person 3. So the way that we need to do that is to correspond to a, or we need to be able to detect, for example, a mouse click. So okay, okay, all right. I just want to make sure I'm doing it consistently with the last time. All right, so the way that we do this is, well, first of all, let's just deal with the first one. Okay, so person one button. Okay, again, we need to point to this particular element, so I'm going to use what I've already used before, which is the document.get element by ID person one underscore button is what I gave the ID to that button. So that points to that element, and then this is the new part, is how we respond to a interaction event, how I respond to a mouse click. The way that I respond to a mouse click is by saying dot on click. Okay, in JavaScript, and we'll do this sort of stuff a different way next week using jQuery, so I'm not going to go too deep into this example, but in plain JavaScript, this is how I handle a mouse event. So we go on click, and then we say equals function like this. Okay, and the reason we need to declare this as a function is because we need this code to operate anytime. We need it to be able to operate more than once. Okay, we're not just going to click it once, we may click it multiple times. So just like we can call our function output person info multiple times, okay, we declare this as a function because a click event is expected to happen any number of times. It might never happen, it might happen once, it might happen 100 times. Okay, so any event handler is always going to be preceded or assigned a value of a function. Okay, and this function has no name, it's called an anonymous function, but that's still the way that we have to write it. So what I want this function to do is basically when I click button 1, I want it to call this function here, output person info, with person 1's data. Okay, so before we do that, let's comment that out. Let's just test that this actually works. Okay, so I'm just gonna throw an alert up that says button clicked. Okay, so here we go. If I click this, all right, that works. Okay, it puts up an alert. Now notice it doesn't work on these other buttons because I've only put that event listener on the element with the ID of person 1 underscore button. Okay, but I know that at least my event handler is working here, so now rather than just putting an alert up, I can tell it to call this output person info with my person 1's data. Alright, so let's see if this works. There we go. So I click that and it outputs that information there. Now when I click it again, even though it doesn't look like it, it's calling that function again and again. It's just outputting the exact same information, so it doesn't look like it. But once we add event listeners to the other two buttons, we should see the same thing. So to add to the other two buttons, I'm going to do the same thing, but that will be person 2 button, and we'll send the output person info function person 2's data, and then the same thing for person 3 button. Okay, so again, I mean, you can see now here how, again, we're writing all of these lines of code once each for each of these people by having put that in a function. Okay, so now each of those buttons should have their own event handler, and they should all call the output person info function when we click the button, but passing them the corresponding person's data based on which button was clicked. Okay, so we'll try person 1 again, and let's try person 3 and person 2. Okay, and we can go back to 1, back to 2. Doesn't matter which order. Okay, so this is what we mean when it's dynamic. There's no predetermined way of knowing which order to output these things in because it's determined based on the user input. So that's why we need a language like JavaScript to be able to dynamically handle doing different things at different times based on different input. Okay, I might just add a couple more things. We can, for example, okay, let's say we want to put a date tag here. So let's say we want to have a paragraph and we want to say information let's actually no, let's leave that empty there. Let's just have a paragraph, and we'll give it. Oh, we'll do it the same way we've done the other ones. So we'll say information generated at span. Give that an ID of date. Okay, and basically I want to output the date whenever this was generated here. Okay, so what we'll do is go back in here, just modify our output person info function, and we'll do another document dot get element by ID. In this case, the date one, and we're going to set its inner HTML to be equal to. And in this case, rather than using an existing variable or a hard-coded value, I'm going to call a JavaScript function called date. And what that will actually do, okay, if you were to search the JavaScript documentation online, it will tell you that it will output a representation of the date at the time which this line of code is executed. Okay, so this will allow us to, this will sort of prove my point that that each time I click on this, okay, you can see it's output the date here. Let's make that a little bigger. Each time I click on it, even if I'm clicking on the same button multiple times, okay, you'll notice that even though this doesn't change, the time changes here. Okay, so it's performing that function every time we click on any of these buttons. Okay, and you'll see that that date is updated there. Okay, now the last thing I want to show you just very quickly is another way. So we've manipulated the document object model, or the HTML elements, by injecting content. Okay, but we can also do things like applying CSS. Okay, so we can apply conditional CSS. So let's say, wow, person 3 is 199 kilos. Guess he is. Okay, so now I've obviously rigged these values for this example such that when I was talking about the BMI before, that I said there were 3 different ranges. So I've rigged this so that each of these people is in one of the different ranges. So the healthy range is between 20 and 25, which person 1 is. Person 2 is underweight, below 20, and person 3 is overweight, above 25. So what I want to do is apply a different, make this a different color. Basically, I want to make this red if they're in an unhealthy weight range, and make it green if they're in a healthy weight range. And the way I'm going to do that is by conditionally applying a class that styles this text either red or green. So what I need is those styles. So I've already got a red style. I'll make a green style, and that can be 00 FF00. That's pretty ugly green. Let's go. It's a healthy looking green there. That looks pretty healthy. Okay. Alright, so that's in my style sheet. So what I'm going to do now is have some, again, inside of my function which outputs the person's info, I'm going to have a line of code which essentially, actually I need to do this slightly differently. I'm going to want to apply it to this entire paragraph here. Okay, so this entire paragraph here, so that this bit of text plus the number that's output actually gets styled in a particular way. So I'm going to need to be able to, with JavaScript, point to this exact paragraph. So the way that I do that is I'll give this paragraph an ID, and I'll call this BMI paragraph. Okay, because I've already used BMI for this span ID, I can't use it the same one. My IDs have to be unique. Okay, so I'll call that BMI paragraph. So what I want to do is use JavaScript to point to this whole paragraph. Okay, and I'll do that by document.get element by ID BMI underscore paragraph. Okay, and I'm going to use a function called add core. No. All right, just need to look that up. That's right. Sorry, class name equals. Okay, and let's say I'll make it. Let's just default make it red, just to see if that works. Okay, so all right, anytime I click that, all right, it's going to apply that class. I should be able to see that in. Where are we here? Okay, so I'll refresh the page again. Okay, there's my paragraph there, has no class applied. When I click that, okay, it now has a class applied of red. Okay, but this universally applies red. I only want to apply red if it's either over 25 or under 20. So I'm just going to put in a conditional statement in here, which says if calculate BMI person.height person.weight. I'll pull this out and put this BMI in its own variable just so it's a bit easier to read. So I go var BMI equals and then do that calculation. So I'll say if BMI is less than 20, or okay, so this is how we say a conditional or statement. These two they're called pipe characters, but it's shift and then the key above enter. That's how you do them. Okay, so that's how we write conditional or. And we use two ampersands for conditional and. Okay, so I'm saying if BMI is less than 20 or BMI is greater than 25, then apply to that paragraph a class name of red. Okay, otherwise apply a class name of green. Alright, let's see if this works. Okay, so there's person 1. Okay, so that 23 is between 20 and 25. Let's apply green. Okay, person 2, 15 is under 20, so it applies red. Go back to person 1. Person 3 over 25 applies red also. Okay, so that's again using some of the things we already learned, the conditional code, but also the new thing here is, and we're also still using this get element by ID to select, but the new thing is that we're applying a class name as well. And this sort of thing, as I said, I wouldn't worry too much about this selecting stuff or this class name stuff so much in plain JavaScript, because next week we'll look at jQuery, which makes all that sort of thing a lot easier and a lot more intuitive to do. Okay, but I'll stop that example there. I think we've gotten through quite a lot. So what I'd recommend is to do this week. Don't worry too much if you know, all of that hasn't sunk in. I did cover a lot, and I more wanted to give you an idea of what sorts of things you could do with JavaScript. I fully expect that you'll have to go and search and look up what the exact syntax are and examples of how to do things, and that's totally okay. I still have to do that all the time as well. But the fortunate thing is there's being the language of the web, there are lots of useful resources online. but particularly, I mean, if you want to figure out how to do something, you can just Google it. So, for example, here just did a Google search of, oh, it's not worked. Okay, that link's broken. But anyway, let's just say if I want to figure out how to output current date. Okay, I just Google JavaScript output current date. Okay, and then I'll get a bunch of links with information about how to do that. Okay, and there's more information about, in this case, how to format it and stuff. Okay, but generally you can find examples of how to do almost anything you want to do in JavaScript just by Googling it. But in terms of just general resources, the link here to this particular this JavaScript Essential Training Linda course is very good if you like following video tutorials. W3 Schools is a good reference. Okay, so if you just want to look up, for example, like I talked about today, functions, this will give you detailed information on exactly what a function is, remind you how to actually how to write it out, what syntax to use. Okay, so that's useful as a reference, but I would say probably the best resource to look at this week is probably this Code Academy one. So Code Academy is this quite nice interactive interface for learning programming languages, and they started off with JavaScript and they've expanded out further, but it gives you without having to go and create any files or anything, it gives you a bunch of step-by-step tasks to do which are designed to teach you incrementally the elements of or the features of JavaScript. So for example, this one here is teaching me about this length property. So it's telling me to type in my name.length. So I'll type that in here. Okay, and then you do a submit code. Sorry, what have I done? Tells you obviously if you've done it incorrect, okay, and gives you hints as to why it might be incorrect. And then when you've done it correctly, it will tell you when you go on to the next lesson. So I highly recommend going through Code Academy this week, getting as far as you think you can. I think this is probably the best way to incrementally go through, but at a slower pace and in more detail, all these things that I've gone over today and more. And I feel that this interactive method is probably the best quickest way of learning JavaScript or the important features of it anyway.